נאווה, הבמה לרשותך.
אז ברוכים הבאים וערב טוב לכולם. אנחנו ננהל את השיחה היום באנגלית, כי יש לנו אורח חשוב, אנדרס סנטו, שנמצא איתנו, ואני עוברת לאנגלית עכשיו. So good evening everybody. For us it's evening, for you Andras it's almost noon, and for Tom it's morning, and I hope you'll join us. And it's an honor and a great pleasure for us to host you, Andras Szanto, and I hope Tom Campbell will join us very soon, and Tanya Cohen-Uzieli in today's meeting. This meeting is in honor of the launch of Andras Szanto's book, The Future of the Museum, 28 Dialogues. The book was published in January this year, and it deals a lot with what we think about all the time, especially in the last year, the Corona year or the COVID-19 year. This year accelerated changes in our lives, in the lives of everybody, and it made us think of many things about our future and a lot about the future of museums. Even before this year, we saw that ICOM International has been working in the recent years to change the definition of the museum. This came from the understanding that the museum needs to refine the definition of the museum, to refine the goals of the museum, to create a dialogue with the public, and to be more and more active and more involved in society. We all remember the big drama that happened during the meeting in Kyoto, the ICOM conference in Kyoto 2019. As soon as the issue of changing the definition came up, the big drama happened. Today, ICOM is making a progress. It's making a process also with the public. We want the public participation in creating the new definition for the term museum. As a member of the International Committee of the Definition of Museum, I must say it's a very challenging task. It's so challenging, and I hope we will succeed. We have a whole program and plan, but we really hope to succeed. We're now getting more and more information from people all over the world who are telling us what they think the definition should be, and we really hope we can find one definition that everybody will agree upon. It's a very difficult task. I'm honored to invite Tanya Cohen-Uzieli, Director of Tel Aviv Museum of Art, to lead this conversation. Andras Szanto is a writer, researcher, and consultant in the fields of art, media, cultural policy, and sponsorship. He is based in New York, and of course, he's the author of the new book that we will be speaking about, The Future of the Museum, 28 Dialogues. Tom Campbell, I hope, will join us. He's the director and CEO of the Fine Arts Museums in San Francisco. Tom is the former director and CEO of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Tanya, the director of the Tel Aviv Museum of Art, you're most welcome to open the discussion. Please, Tanya. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nava. I think that we have to to make this conversation more like a dialogue and not as a moderation with how we thought actually at the beginning. I had the privilege to have this interesting dialogue with Andras and to be part of this book. And I want to mention few rows of the press release. First of all, I want to show you the book. This is the book, and is on sale on our bookshop, on our shop at the Tel Aviv Museum, and of course on Andras' website and Amazon and wherever. And the press release says that what emerges from the 28 dialogues, all conducted during the global pandemic, is a composite portrait of a generation of museum leaders working to move away from old models and make art institutions more open, inclusive, experiential, cultural, polyphonic, technological savvy, attuned to the needs of their communities, and engage in defining issues of our time. Today's institutions are transforming into places of gathering, community, and debate, expanding their role well beyond the traditional function of art museum. And I think that this connect us of what Nava was saying with the struggle to define this museum. But Andras, going back to the book, you started working on the future of the museum during the lockdown. I remember this vividly. I sat down with the kind of this Zoom, and we have this very interesting and inspiring dialogue. Museums around the world were closed, business model collapsed. Nobody knew what was going to happen next. But what was interesting during this time, that museums around the world came up with extraordinary creative ideas. I think that everybody needs the feeling to reinvent ourselves. And I would like to ask you, which was, in your opinion, the most significant project or a project that we couldn't do during the COVID time, before COVID time, we will do or we will never do again? I think that you were the one who was monitoring all of this realm. So please.
Yes, well, I'd first like to just start by acknowledging the wonderful time that we had with your conversation and with the 28 other directors. And it's hard to believe that it is now a year later and so many museums are still closed. I mean, that was certainly not something we anticipated. It felt when we began this book that we are capturing a kind of short, unique moment, a kind of blip, but that has turned into a rather extended one. Nevertheless, I think in so many ways this pandemic, it had these sort of surprising silver linings, and one of them was that we were able to have these long, involved conversations. People opened up, they showed a lot of vulnerability. It was a time of very earnest and frank conversations, and I think the one with you is an example of that. I also should mention, just so that everybody else understands, this is part of pandemic life. We started planning this Zoom call before the time changed. And of course, the times change in different countries at different times. And it's early morning in San Francisco where Tom is, and I sincerely hope that he'll be able to join us at some point. Either way, we will entertain you with our conversation. And then I'll return to your questions. So what were the sort of amazing things? Hold on one second. Tom is going to be coming very shortly. So like in the news, experienced newscasters know how to sort of use up time until everybody is able to be present. I think I was on another call this morning, actually on a jury call for a wonderful award. And there were a couple of museum directors on it. And I asked them the same question because I was preparing for our talk. And one of the directors, who's the director of the Liebchen House in Munich, he said that the most radical gesture any museum could have made is to not lay off any staff, not cancel any exhibitions, and not delay any loans. I actually am not sure at all if any museum meets that standard. It would be a very interesting research for the ICOM to do, whether any museum in the world has been able to say, we're going to keep everybody, we're going to keep moving. But I can no longer dodge the question of what were the interesting projects. And of course, I want to start with the project you did, Anya, because I think that was inspirational for many people. It wasn't the only project of its kind, but it was a very wonderful idea of taking the museum outside the wall, of delivering the art experience, as it were. Could you just hold 1 second, because Tom is trying to get in.
To know what his name and to find him. So just a second.
Yes, please, you handle
Tom Campbell.
There are 143 people attending this talk. So you have to identify him.
Yes, so a few seconds and I will find him, don't worry.
Great. And so what I thought was really wonderful about these projections on those wonderful Bauhaus buildings in Tel Aviv is that it was delivering on the core function of the museum that couldn't be done inside, doing it outside. But there were a lot of interesting initiatives I would mention. One of them was the Frick did these cocktails at the Frick series where they began. I just looked up the date, the first one, and there's Tom. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Tom.
Sorry, we had a time difference.
We had a time problem, but we have introduced you. So you are already in and it's okay.
Yeah,
So you have me
Thank
here
you
without
very
my
much
makeup.
to adjust your time to our conversation.
And so
Welcome.
while you catch your breath and get a sip of your coffee, Tom, I'm answering the first question, which is what were some interesting projects that the museums did in the pandemic?
Sure.
By the way, Tom and I met in New York last week for our first dinner since the pandemic. It was extraordinary, fun thing to do. In terms of interesting projects, well, your projections were great. I was just mentioning the Frick actually very early in April began a series of cocktails with the curator, which I thought was inspired because it was a clever and simple idea about how to bring the museum function into this weird world of Zoom that was appropriate to the genre, as it were. There was still a possibility of sharing the intellectual substance of the museum, but doing it in a kind of casual way and really emphasizing the human beings behind the museum. I was also very struck by some of the very poetic almost gestures that museums were making. The garage in Moscow, which served hot meals to elderly people and to hospital staff in the vicinity of the museum. The beautiful project and the museums in Dresden, where I think 10,000 postcards were written by members of the museum staff who just wrote handwritten postcards to people in the community, which they mailed to them. I thought that was a very beautiful example of what can be done. And I should mention Tom, when he reopened, did an invitational show at the museum, which he can talk more about, where he invited artists from the wider community. Numerous, operating COVID stations, testing stations, and really using this moment to actualize a lot of ideas that museums have been having about community engagement, community relevance, that perhaps earlier in the cycle of exhibitions and openings and events were more marginal, and yet had been very much part of the discussion. So the short answer in the end is, I think the most interesting things were experiments that museums in this unique situation were able to make that pushed them beyond the standard rotation of, blockbuster shows and measuring the number of people who come into the museum. That metric was gone. And in its stead came the metric of, are we relevant in the lives of people? So with that, I'll hand the same question to Tom.
Tom, do you want to interfere and give us your sense of these activities that were done?
Sure. I mean, I think we saw, as Andras was indicating, we saw a huge amount of sort of entrepreneurial and innovative activity in the digital sphere. And Andras has mentioned a couple. I mean, we early on in the pandemic, the Rijksmuseum and then the Getty Museum did that kind of global challenge of getting people to kind of imitate, dress up like their favorite paintings. And I think that was a wonderful sort of very accessible, very humorous way of having some fun, but also getting people thinking about art. And I hope it kind of gets baked into secondary school curriculums in the future, looking at art in the local institutions and, slow looking, but having some fun too. Another initiative I think I've watched with a lot of interest is Brooklyn Rail in New York have turned their kind of occasional interview program into an almost daily process. They've been interviewing artists, curators, museum directors, creatives, and really, I think just being a real locus of energy. And then, yes, I mean, Andras mentioned the open invitational exhibition we did at the De Young Museum. And that was an innovation for us. It was great fun. We had to cancel or postpone a number of big exhibitions. So during the pandemic, we saw it as an opportunity to really reach out to Bay Area artists. And we invited them to submit. We thought we might get a few hundred submissions. And in the event, we got more than 11,500 works from more than 6,000 artists. And we selected about 800. We hung them salon style, corner to corner, floor to ceiling. And they were all for sale with 100% of the profit going to the artists. So it was a real opportunity to support the artists in the Bay Area. And it was a fascinating cross-section of the kind of the hopes and the fears and the dreams that the artists were having during the pandemic. And we were only able to open it for 8 weeks before we were closed. This was last fall when we briefly reopened and before we were closed down again. But it was an immense morale boost, both for the staff at the museum, but I think also for the larger community. So, I think we saw an amazing amount of creativity and innovation going on across the sector.
What you both have pointed out, I think this was a kind of a sense of urgency and opportunity that this crisis actually offered to us. And I can say this even from my point of view. We have hanged the exhibition of an outsider artist that I'm not sure that we would do this. It was a program, and we have invested a lot on our local artistic community. So a year into crisis, we have already opened 2 months ago, but there are other museums that are not open. When you are looking at programming, at staff, at planning, exhibition, do you think that actually this crisis has indeed accelerated changes? Or are we going as museum directors to think differently when we are approaching program? And this is something, Tom, that I would like to ask you directly on this regard.
Sure. Yes, without any question. I think the museum industry, having become very invested in quite specialized scholarship during the 1980s and the 1990s, had begun to swing back towards a broader awareness of the audiences it serves in the early 2000s. And I think a lot of museums had been investing in reaching out to younger, to more diverse audiences with some success. But I think that the enormous shift that's taken place over the last year, beyond the pandemic, beyond the financial crisis, is the new reckoning that's going on with inequity, societal inequity, and systemic racism. And especially in America, spurred by the kind of polarizing nature of the Trump administration. I think a large part of the population has become much more activist, much more engaged, and museums are almost like a kind of one of the your word, the agoras, one of the forums in which this discussion is being played out. And I think very rapidly we are having to rethink the narratives we tell, the broader narratives about society, the narratives we tell about individual works of art. And in many respects, this is very uncomfortable. We're really having to rip the Band-Aid off. But at the same time, it's an incredible privilege and very exciting to be in a position of leadership in a cultural institution at this moment. I think we're literally going through a change that it will be, when people look back in the future, it will be as dramatic as, the shift from academy to impressionism in the late 19th century, or from representation to abstraction in the early 20th century. I mean, maybe the analogy is even with, the medieval mindset to the Renaissance, but happening in a period of 2 or 3 years.
And back to you, Andras, what I want to connect to what Tom said. When I read Adam Levine from Toledo Museum of Art in Ohio, as we tell people what is good by putting it on our walls, people trust us. And he was speaking about the museum enormous power, and this connected to what you were saying. And you, Tom, suggested that in order to keep the public trust, we need to become more aware of the habits, bad practices that we inherited, often without even realizing it. We have to step back and look with fresh eyes at what we are doing and the narratives we are telling here in Israel. I want to say that we have, like in USA, a multifaceted population. We have Arab Jews, Ashkenazi, Sephardi, refugees, new immigrants from Russia, Ethiopia, secular, religious. So we understand that we need to tell stories that are more inclusive, less one-sided, and to bring down boundaries, to avoid being perceived as an ivory tower, and to address our multicultural population. Andras, after you have heard so many ideas and so many statements, what are your thoughts of how we can achieve this? Because we were so used to tell one-sided narrative, how we are going off the pedestals, like you were saying.
Yeah, well, I think, and I will answer that exact question. I just want to say that it's a very interesting thought experiment. What would the last year have looked like had George Floyd not been killed? Because that added this extra dimension that maybe would have been there, but not as pronounced. Basically, for museums, there were 3 huge adaptations. Each of them led to innovations. One was a adaptation to a health crisis. And it's incredibly impressive how quickly museums retooled, like many organizations, to adapt to that situation. Very complex, many things behind the scenes that people don't even recognize, like how do you get your staff to come to work if they're afraid to come to work? But those were relatively solvable problems. The next layer of innovation was around the adaptation to this new working environment where your basic business model is on hold. And here again, I think we saw many innovations, some of which will prove to be lasting, the full embrace of digital outreach, the final realization. You know, Tom 10 years ago was putting up more than 100 people in the digital office at the Met. But now I think nobody can doubt that that is a central and core mechanism of a museum, and many other changes, some of which will be lasting, some not. And then there was this third element, which is the reckoning around the public trust, the programming, the narratives, and the belated realization that the stories that museums were telling, the programming they were doing, the outreach they were doing, even though their intentions might have been good, were suddenly revealed to be failing. So how do you respond? I think what I think is the most likely answer to how to change the narrative is by changing the people who are the custodians of that narrative. And I think there's some very welcome news in that respect, because museums have been making important staff changes in terms of who is at the table when decisions are made about the programming, in terms of who are the people whose voices, whose expertise and experience inform the exhibitions, the formation of collections, the interpretation of objects. And last but not least, although here I think progress has been the slowest, who are the people at the trustee level, at the highest level, who actually make the most consequential decisions, who inform those choices? Because all of those things will be involved in that adaptation. And museums are not the only arenas. If you saw the Oscars last night, you can see what a radical departure, not just in terms of location, but in emphasis and who's talking and about whom. Who's talking and about whom. That's what it all boils down to.
Very interesting. And let's connect it so globally of this change. And in my dialogue, I have chosen the local and the global as terms of reference in order to refine the role of the Tel Aviv Museum. And in particular in our highly charged geopolitical environment. Now, I thought that we needed to think globally in telling the story of modern art, but must act locally by showcasing local art, being relevant to our local population. The current pandemic, because we think here in Israel that we are post-COVID, but actually it's current crisis. During this time, the debate on globalization, I think that has acquired a kind of, I would say, a renewed relevance. So maybe it's time to ask, how has the globalization affected museums around the world? And at the end, has it been ultimately mainly a positive or a negative force? Tom?
Well, I think, you know, if one of the things that we've learned from this last year is how incredibly interconnected we all are. A pandemic can sweep around the world. It used to be in horror movies, and now we've seen it playing out in real time, day by day, you know, month by month, week by week, day by day. So I think we do all have a heightened sense of our global interconnectedness. And with such a large percentage of the population now online, digital, we've all been browsing, not everybody, of course, because there's still a huge divide in who has access and who doesn't to digital, but a privileged, a wealthier part of the world has been browsing, internationally. So that is, I think there is this new sense of heightened awareness, a heightened global dialogue. And we as institutions, in our new awareness of the degree to which we are political, we used to think we were apolitical. Now we realize that's a luxury of living in a balanced, democratic state. But when things are going out of whack, you are a political entity and you have a responsibility to advocate for the humanist values you believe in. So I think that cultural institutions, art museums, museums as a whole, are likely all to be much more activist going forward. I know the exhibition program that we've rebuilt in this moment is really leaning in, making an effort to represent at a much higher degree women artists and artists of color, and to engage with certain key issues. On the flip side, at the local level, with the collapse of tourism, we're all, by necessity, thrown back on our communities. I think many institutions had already been working to cultivate those communities. For example, here in San Francisco, well before COVID, we had started a free Saturday program to try and bring in a wider, more diverse population from around the Bay. But I think during the pandemic, we're all really thinking about who we serve. And again, it's, how do you define community? You have to bring in people from your communities into direct dialogue. And that's somewhat impeded by COVID and by the health restrictions. But that's something I'm really looking forward to building on, our free Saturdays, our open invitational. And as we go forward, I think that's going to be one of the most exciting areas of our work in the next couple of years, is that working locally.
Can I also just say, my first real exposure to a lot of international museum was actually through a collaboration with Tom, and he was running the Met, and he instigated an institute which I had the great pleasure of working on, which was the Global Museum Leaders Colloquium. And this was we would invite a dozen or so directors from around the world to spend almost 2 weeks at the Met, talking to each other, learning from each other. And one of the things I was sensitized is that those issues which we now see foregrounded in ICOM's discussion around the kind of redefinition of the museum were front and present for these museum directors, and particularly from directors coming from developing economies around the world. So the sort of new museology, which had a strong emphasis on beyond the core functions of the museum, on community engagement, on issues of equity, justice, this sort of broader agenda that ICOM is working, rather with complications, as was mentioned earlier, but has been working to integrate into a kind of a larger definition of museum. I was very much sensitized to that. And if you look at ICOM's voting and even the more recent surveys, that international museum community has been a very, very active voice in this sort of broadening of the definition of the museum. It reminds me a little bit of what's happening in the Catholic Church, with Latin America sort of bringing in a kind of new view on the church. So I think that one of the consequences of globalization is that with museums spreading across the globe into very different social situations than in the affluent North, those institutions have embraced a more proactive, community-facing social agenda, which happened to align very well with this moment. And I think that together, what it leads to, and this is sort of a fundamental insight, I think, in this book, is that it's giving rise to a more pluralistic view on what a museum can be, not just in terms of the many functions it can serve, but the many different ways a museum can appear in the world. It doesn't always have to look like a Greek temple or something made by a Swiss architect, you know, for a northern country. And so I see this effect of globalization as being incredibly positive and generative for the museum field.
Yeah, I fully agree.
So I want to continue and say, if each one of you can give me in one sentence his own definition of museum. I remember when in our dialogue, Andras, you asked me, so what do you think? What is a museum? and I thought, wow, after 2 hours that we are talking about, why you are asking me this? And at the end, I thought that it was important for me to make this one sentence and to define in one sentence the role of this museum, of what is a museum.
I asked this
An
question.
exercise, and I know that it's difficult.
It's the one question I asked every director. And one of the things I've learned also as a consultant is that when you ask a director to say the mission of their museums, you'll get a very long answer instead of a short answer. So the same is true in this respect. But Tom, you go first.
I mean, obviously there are, and your book wonderfully demonstrates the many different approaches and answers. And I try and capture it. I think of a museum as being a place where we connect our visitors with objects and ideas from the past and the present, so that they understand where their own culture, where they're coming from. They understand other people, and they are empowered with a sense of their own creative agency in their future. I think so many people don't understand their own creative agency. And I think museums, perhaps the highest thing we can do is to inspire that in people.
And I would say that it's interesting, in the ICOM's latest survey, they asked people from all around the world in ICOM, what are some of the most important attributes of museums? And the most obvious things didn't even show up in the top 10, but I think that's because those are axiomatic. Of course, there's art, exhibitions, collections, scholarship, preservation. That's axiomatic. So accepting that, I would beyond that say, a museum is an indispensable nexus for the community and the welcoming home for the individual.
Wow, thank you. So let's go back to the bread and butter of the museum, and let's go to the importance of collection. And I think that the accessioning has become a much talked subject with so many institutions, and particularly during the COVID, and particularly in the USA, in needs of fund. And even here in Israel, we recently had a case of the accessioning that was that reached actually international news. And I know that the Board of Trustees of the Association of American Art Museum has not changed the rules during the current crisis, but it has addressed differently how museum might use the proceeds from the accessioning. Do you think that are we going to see a kind of an epidemic questionable the accessioning during this trembling time and this crisis? Do you think that the institution will take advantage of this situation, Tom?
Well, that certainly is happening. For your listeners who may not know about this situation, deaccessioning is a long-standing practice especially at American museums. And the rule that has kind of controlled the process for several decades is that any money that is raised through deaccessioning objects could only be used to buy other art objects. And now, during this crisis, the Association of Art Museum Directors has loosened this rule to allow museums to apply some of the proceeds to collection care. The problem about this, and I wrote about it in the Apollo magazine, is that defining collection care it's a bit like, you know, how long is a piece of string? It could be anything from conservation of an object to rebuilding the roof or the storage areas in which objects are stored, or paying the guards. So that's one problem. The second is they've put a 2-year window on this, which I think will be hard to police, because institutions could argue for many years to come that they're still suffering the impact of the COVID crisis. And for me, the real problem is the undermining of public trust. People give objects to museums in the understanding that they will be, you know, they'll be held in perpetuity, or if they are deaccessioned, it will be to acquire other artworks, not to pay the light bills. And I worry that this really exposes especially smaller and university museums, where they may be, the old adage of the board's role is give, get, or get off. And this slightly shifts the responsibility from museum boards from being philanthropists to being asset managers. And there could be tax ramifications. So this is why I've been quite cautious about this.
And do you think?
I think there's another. Sorry.
Do you think that legislation can help on this matter? I mean, even in the USA, I don't know how the legislation can help museums, but in a way, do you think that there is a need of a public or a more governmental intervention on this?
I would hope not. I think that boards are the fiduciaries of their institutions. They have the responsibility they know their institutions best. I think the danger of the government getting involved is it can be very heavy-handed, and what works for one institution doesn't work for another institution, even down the road, let alone in another state. So I think that, my hope is that the AAMD will reassert its former rules at the end of this 2-year window, and that then we will have a thoughtful debate about the future. Another area that we should talk about is deaccessioning isn't just for raising funds. It's also about the restitution of objects that, for one reason or another, the board decides, the institution decides they should be returned to possibly where they came from originally. And I think that's a very interesting area that we perhaps should, I want to hand over to Andras, but we should perhaps touch on in a minute.
I think, as with so many things, when it comes to issues of ethics, because this is an ethical question ultimately, there are few absolutes, and each institution has unique circumstances and ethical guidelines, as with biblical guidelines, are always interpreted in particular situations. So I think the fact that there's a strong condemnation doesn't mean that these are absolute. And earlier this morning in another conversation I had, somebody pointed out, well, what about a big museum like the Tate in London, which ended up losing a very large part of its staff. And so now when you walk into that organization, it's lost so much in terms of expertise and competence. So I should also just state the obvious that no institution wants to deaccession. Everybody would be very happy to receive government funding. Everybody would be very happy to operate in a climate where contemporary works of art don't cost hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars, as was the case 60 years ago. So it's a complex issue. And I think when you talk about lawmakers and regulators, I would like to believe that the museum sector should be able to self-police this issue. However, one point I would make is, I think there's two dangers here. One is that we're overstating something. As with the prognoses about, literally in this country, we were told maybe thousands of museums would close as a result of this epidemic. I don't know of a single one that's closed. I think that there's a fear, partly because of the way the press juices up these things, that we are sort of agonizing over this issue. Secondly, and I think this is a bigger point, there's a little bit of a danger of fighting yesterday's wars, because in fact, the real question is, Tom and I recently had conversations about this, the world of finance, the world of money, how institutions raise money, the entire ecosystem and infrastructure of financial technologies is going through a radical transformation as we speak. The question of what is money, the question of how objects are traded. If you just look at what happened with the FTP market, maybe it's a topic we return to later. It's a little bit like the internet when it came along. It's going to be transformative. And whatever the outcomes are, museums have a choice to make eventually. Will they embrace these innovations? Deaccessioning will relate to that, but there's far more at stake. There's a kind of a new economy that's showing up. And I suspect that while we're talking about deaccessioning now, which is a debate that this sector has been having for literally a century, the real issues we should be addressing are, what is our position on cryptocurrencies and new trading platforms and all these things that are actually transforming our lives now? And I see very little attention to that at the moment in the field. And yet that's where the real money will be.
And this brings me actually to this hottest topic in the last 3 weeks, the NFTs. It is clear that this will affect how we value and trade art. But how do you think that this development of works that exist and are owned virtually at the end will affect the art museum now and in the future? And do you think that is it a phenomenon that will prevail in parallel and will not have a direct effect on a physical museum, yes or not? I was asked during these last 3 weeks, several times about this issue, and I would like to ask you, what do you think about this?
Can I just maybe, since I can build on my point, and then that gives time for Tom to consider the question. Well, number one, I think what we saw in the last few weeks is a kind of epileptic seizure of the art world that is not the new norm. I think that the last few weeks were a kind of fast-paced bubble that played out, and I wouldn't be too concerned about that. I think that in the last decade, we have been seeing a whole slew of digitally enabled artworks, which frankly, museums were never designed to host. Museums are machines to display painting, sculpture, photography. Basically, even video art and film were difficult to kind of retrofit into the museum. And so with the emergence of virtual reality, augmented reality, participatory works, things that really don't require a gallery as we understand it, this is a big question for the museum in general, and it requires new imaginations, new competencies, new academic perspectives, a new generation of thinkers and curators and enablers, and frankly, architects to imagine how this type of art fits in. Lastly, Tom mentioned important ruptures. And you mentioned, Tom, the emergence of the end of the academy. And I think that actually applies here really, because what was happening in the breakdown of the academy is there were too many painters in Paris. The system was working exceedingly well. The salons were bringing, all those pictures of the salons with like too many art that you could, and a new mechanism emerged alongside the academy, which were the art dealers, the Durand Ruels and the Vollards and all these people who embraced the artists who were left out of the academy. And I think this FTP, you can look at it in a similar way. New mobility channels are coming into view, new channels that participate in the sale and validation of art that is tied to the digital sphere. And for the moment, museums are completely outside of this matrix. Many people believe it's not the job of the museum to engage that super contemporary creativity. Let civil society sort it out. Let the commercial sphere sort it out. I think this is one of those big challenges we need to look at in the face, because clearly the museum that you're running, Tanya, or you, Tom, were not, these were not built into the assumptions of those organizations and those buildings.
Tom, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the notion that this is kind of this a revolutionary change, everything would, I don't really buy into that. I think that museums are already struggling to present film and digital art. It's a different gear to the kind of mind gear you're in when you're looking at paintings and sculptures. And film and digital art tend to work better in environments that are specifically dedicated to that medium. So I think NFTs, the impact will likely be most in those kind of forums, not for historical museums like my own. I'm a bit naive about this. I mean, it seems to me that you're paying a lot of money to own a glorified screensaver that other people can still watch in duplicate forms. So I think the real headache here is going to be a bit like artist rights. And that's really where money is going to be made. And lawyers' fees will be collected at no doubt huge rates far into the future.
Thank you. As a closure, because we are approaching the hour, I want to mention the subtitle of the dialogue that you have with Hans Ulrich Obrist, that says, generosity is the medium every museum should have at its core. And I was struck by this term, generosity, and I adopted it. And I want to ask you, Tom, how can we as director of museum be more generous towards our public? How can we do this, realize it?
I think there are two parts for my answer on this, and I'll try and make it short. The first is that we are going through a moment of reckoning and recognition that while we serve a certain constituency very well, we have been unfriendly and unwelcoming to another part of the population who we should be serving better. And I'm talking obviously about, in America, about the African American and Native American populations, and more generally people of color. So that's one area where we have got to do a better job. The other, I think the other sphere that's so important here is in the relationship between European and American museums and museums elsewhere in the world. So many of the collections, especially in Europe, were developed during colonial times. And although the institutions saw themselves as centers of education and enlightenment, they were built on the back of colonial appropriation. And if we are truly to be these generous educational centers, irrespective of the laws that especially European museums hide behind, we've got to find a way of restituting and sharing those great collections. Many of those objects came Africa, South America, Asia, and the Middle East, parts of Asia. So I think that's a critical part of what we'll be discussing and doing in the next decade.
Thank you, Andras. How can we adopt this generosity?
I think Tom put it very eloquently. I mean, generosity is not making someone walk up 100 steps to get to the museum. Generosity is not taking other people's cultural artifacts and displaying them as your own. Generosity is not having a monopoly on what an object means. Generosity is not having a one-way communication with your audience, but engaging in a dialogue with them. Generosity is making sure that there's a bench for people to sit on when they look at art. And generosity is using language that people understand without feeling culturally inferior. I think it's a change in posture that is horizontal rather than vertical or hierarchical. What I saw in the writing of this book and the collection of these voices, and two of you are here, is that this is the work of this generation of museum directors. And I'm sorry to say it won't be finished by this generation. I think this is the generation that really opened up to this need, but I think it will probably be a next generation that has the chance to sort of fully deliver on it.
So I think that we finished. Thank you very much. I do think that from this conversation emerged the fact that this crisis accelerated a lot of different processes that were on the track, but now we really understand the urgency of them. I think that we are close to the redefinition of what is a museum. And I certainly hope that we are emerging from this crisis more stronger than we were. I hope that soon we can meet in person. And we took advantage of this meeting, but I am a romantic person, so I believe that the human being has to meet physically like we are meeting in a museum. So thank you very much. Thank you, Nava, for hosting us.
Yes, there is a question, Tanya, on the Q&A. Maybe we should refer to that. And then, would you look at it?
Yeah. I don't see the question. Do you want to read it, Nava? Because I cannot.
Yes, I'll open it. I just got an SMS that there is a question. Okay. Okay.
So
I'll read it to you. What about spatial installations of digital and interactive nature? They have already been a huge part of museums and galleries. Isn't it that NFTs are just a way of owning and trading artworks, and the technology behind it can be applied to all existing genres of digital produced art? This is the question, long question.
I think, yes, the answer is absolutely. And I think we have to recognize that the conventions of display, the idea of the exhibition, the various tools and strategies that curators and museums use to display art developed over hundreds of years. And we are now talking about works that were barely here 3 moments ago. So I think that it will really take a long time, especially as we leave behind the idea of the museum as purely a physical space. It will take a long time for us to sort of settle on the new conventions of the physical and virtual spaces in which we engage with art. And again, I think that's going to be very much part of the next generation's responsibility.
We have to leave something for future generations.
Yes, you really do.
Yeah, I think so. For the next 30, 40 years from now.
Yeah, and
Thank
the other
you very much. No, Tom.
No, I was going to say the other factor that is, we're all, as museums, we're having to reckon with is this explosion of new digital immersive experiences, which are, very appealing in this era of social media. People want to Instagram from, the Van Gogh experience, or this new wave of super galleries that Pace is developing, the super blue experiential venues. And I think museums, we're going to have to figure out, is that something we also are going to try and embrace, or is that a separate entity? Is that, we're first and foremost educational installations at the moment, that it's kind of largely defined by a kind of more entertainment motivation, but the two obviously can meet in the middle. So this is something, it's exciting. We've got to figure it out though, and it's going to take space and a lot of money if we're going to really get into it seriously.
We'll have to de-accession stuff just to make it happen.
Wow, this was a strong declaration. Okay.
I just want to thank you.
Thank you very much for this conversation, and we will continue in another context. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm sorry that for all of this, the sophistication of our technology, we were late, but I apologize. Happy to be here.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andras, and thank you, Tom. And special thanks to Tanya for the cooperation in organizing this fascinating meeting. Thank you to all our participants. Thank you for joining us, joining us, and have a good evening. And you have a good day.
Good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.